Hello and welcome back to the show. Today I want to bring you a how to play video for White Forest in the times of Dark Magician of Destruction and best friend Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, but this time with the inclusion of not only Fallen of the White Dragon, but in particular Blazing Cartesia the Virtuous and best friend Dusk Dragon. If you already understand the ins and outs of White Forest and the fundamental game plan, you can just continue watching, but if you do not understand how this deck works or what makes it good, I highly recommend you check out my intro to White Forest with DMod. First, link in the description below. This video will build on top of that one and it will not hold your hand as much. In this video, I will go over the basic game plan. I'll show you two different combo lines that explain the goal you're trying to achieve with every hand you draw in this deck, and then I will do an analysis of a gameplay against Dracotail branded. That will be a best of 3 game. So you'll basically get the full package in this video. Okay, so there are two main fundamental differences to White Forest Pure, of course that includes Dark Magician of Destruction in these days, and White Forest with Blazing Cartesia. The first main difference is Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon. In the old times, your Synchro 8 was Diabell Queen, and you can still make that card, but this card, if you think about it, is really the end of a ladder, and during that ladder, not only do you make Arciela, which is a searcher, but you're going to use Arciela and Azamina Elzet to go into your 8. And going into the 8 with Azamina Elzet as the material is what gives you your Azamina bridge. So if you haven't already drawn cards like Black Witch or Deception, etc., this card is what bridges into the Azamina part of the engine and adds a huge amount of insulation. And generally speaking, whatever version of White Forest you're playing, you want to hold access to your Diabell's the White Witch until as late as possible so that you can bring this out, and that also gives you access to Diabell Star Vengeance. And this card obviously is not only a pop, but is also a special summon. And in the pure version, you also has an option, the Poplar of the White Forest card, which I'll talk about more in a second. So generally speaking, whatever version of White Forest you're playing, you're trying to go through the ladder, which bridges you into all the Azamina stuff, and hold your Diabell's the White Witch and your Vengeance until the very end, because these cards need insulation. The thing that makes this different, or one of the two main things that makes this different, is that instead of going for Diabell Queen, which is the end of your ladder, and you've already accomplished your searches through Arciela and using Elzet Azamina as your synchro material, instead of that, you go into Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon. And this allows you to continue playing instead of just ending on an okay boss monster. It's not that Diabell Queen is a bad card per se, it's an okay boss monster, but this card gives you so much more card economy, and you will have a much better grind game and ability to play through interactions because of this card. So I'll talk about this more when I show you the actual combo. But this card, being treated as a different boss monster and also an extension to your combo engine, is the first fundamental difference. The second fundamental difference is up to how you decide to build this deck, and I want to go over here what cards I think are optional versus you have to play. So the most important thing here is that Fallen of the White Dragon is a card that can be played at 1, but it can also be played at 2 or 3. And if you want to play this card at 3, the main reason for doing that is because the card quality on this is better than basically any other card in the entire deck. The main restriction here is that this will lock you into level 8 fusion or synchro monsters if you are using the special summon effect from hand. You don't need to do that, and the reason that this card can just be played at 1 is because you don't actually ever have to draw this for this to work, because you're going to tutor it out off of Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon. But it is just worth mentioning that you can choose to play this deck with 3 of this card, and then you treat this kind of like Diabell's the White Witch or Witch of the White Forest, in the sense that you're going to hold this until last because you don't want to lock yourself first. You keep the lock until the end, and then you play with this card. And if you do summon this from hand by dumping Albion, then the Albion will give you access to the Fallen and the Virtuous during the end phase. So that is still a solid card to play at 3. I'm choosing to play it at 1 for now, but I think you can argue for 2 or 3 copies of this card. If you want to stick at 40, you can choose to cut down on Betrayal. I talk about this more in my previous intro to White Forest video and why I play 3 of these, so I'm not going to go over that here. But you could, for example, cut 1 or 2 of these to add more Fallen of the Dragon. You could go to 42. Some people do like to cut Witch of the White Forest. I think this is an extraordinary card. And the Dark Lock doesn't really matter in most cases, because if this is your only way to play, it doesn't matter, this is your only way to play. And if it's not your only way to play, then you hold it until later and then you use the card later on. This also does not conflict with any of the Ecclesia stuff, because these cards are all light. You know, like this is a light, the Dusk Dragon is a light, and many of the targets that you would otherwise use off of this are also lights. So that's just something that's worth mentioning. A few other things to note about the extra deck and some other optional cards here are First of all, this card, Despian Luluwalith, is not the best 12 you can play in White Forest, but if you are playing the Dust Dragon variant, you do need to have a target, or you probably should have a Dust Dragon target to bring out a free Despia card from the extra deck. And I think having a 12 that you can naturally make, but also is a Dust Dragon target, this one is just obviously the best one. If you look at the other cards in here, if you are on Fallen the Virtuous, which you kind of like have to be if you're playing this package, then you do need, I would say, aside from Ecclesia the Dark Dragon, one other target, which then has to be Albion the Mad Dragon. If you are playing Dust Dragon, which you are if you're on this version with Cartesia, then you need to have an offensive target for it, which is going to be Cloud Beast. So this card I'm considering a major card that should be in the main deck. There are two other cards here that I would say are flexible. Now, the Chorozo line is not good. It has never been good, but it is more valuable these days because of Demod. You get a little bit more value out of it. And I would say that Mo Regina and also Saint are still usable cards. And actually, there are cases where Mo Regina, you can have like a setup where this card gives you a tremendous amount of value because you have something like Wanted in the graveyard to trigger this for a double pop, and you also have Azamina Elzet to go into a Chaos Angel, a Light and Dark Chaos Angel with this card. So you can often like clear boards and create a huge amount of pressure just because you have this card in your deck. But I would say that this is an optional card. And one of the things that I have missed in certain games is being able to go for the Diabels, the White Witch, and the Vengeance, usually after everything else has failed. I've gone through all of my engine, my opponent has used all of their resources, and then I finally get Vengeance on board. The Vengeance brings out the Poplar of the White Forest, and then that gives us access to Doom Dragon, and then that can ladder into Vengeance Dragon. And you could take out Chorozo and Regina, and you could put in Doom Dragon and Poplar of the White Forest, but it does feel kind of less effective if you don't also have Vengeance Dragon in the extra deck as your 12. But Luluwalith is our 12 here. So, you know, you kind of have to pick and choose what you're going to play. I guess you could take out Chaos Angel, which is slightly less good if you're not playing Mo Regina, and then you could instead have these three out, and you could put the entire Doom Dragon, Poplar, and Vengeance Dragon back in the extra deck. And this is basically a package that is kind of like what the Raging Phoenix Zealantix combo was like in the Snake Eyes days, where it doesn't have to come up, but when it does come up, it is basically a completely guaranteed OTK button that your deck otherwise does not have access to. So that's just how you can think about that. Okay, so now let me show you what the deck is supposed to do with a couple of basic combos, and once I've done that, I'll go over to do the gameplay review. Okay, so here I'm going to show you just Elzet of the White Forest and a blank Speller Trap, and we will run through the line here. I will not put as much detail here as I did in my previous video because I'm assuming that you have watched it or you already understand how the deck functions basically. So here we pitch our Speller Trap to summon out Elzet of the White Forest, and of course we search for Sylvie. You normal summon Sylvie and you search for Tails. This is all the super basic stuff. You go into Arciela, you pitch your Tails. Now, most people will search Witch of the White Forest here. There are cases where you do not want to search this and you actually want to go directly for Elzet Azamina because you're afraid of certain types of counterplay by your opponent. But because this is just a combo in a vacuum to show you what the deck is trying to do, I'm going to search for Witch of the White Forest first. Now we get to reset our Tails. We can use Tails, get Elzet Azamina, we summon Elzet Azamina. Now normally in the old version of the deck, this is where you go into Diabel Queen on summon 5. And that's very important because on summon 5, you would typically go chainlink 1 Elzet Azamina to search for Deception, so this bridges you into your Azamina stuff, and chainlink 2 Diabel Queen to add back the Tails, which will usually be your pitch fodder for Diabel Queen. Now in this case, you do not get the chain block, but you still do get the search off of Elzet Azamina, and this card will become useful later on. So Ecclesia and Dark Dragon will stay on the field for now. We're going to use Elzet Azamina and search for our Deception. Now, typically here, unless you want to tribute something else, you bring out the Sylvie from the graveyard, you use your Deception, and now you can do your Azamina stuff. Now, you always pay attention that when you're doing this combo, again, whatever version of the deck you're playing, you will always hold your Witch of the White Forest or whatever your access to Diabel's the White Witch and then Vengeance is until the very last moment. You do not want to use all of your resources before you have created your insulation. So your opponent either needs to respond to your threats, or they don't respond and you put your insulation up first, and then when you finally commit to Witch of the White Forest and Diabel's the White Witch and Vengeance, then you're much safer. So here we tribute the Sylvie, we get the Hallowed Azamina. Hallowed can now bring out the Murcielago. Murcielago can search for Wanted. Unless you already have access to this, you will always search the Wanted here. You go Hallowed Chainlink 1, Wanted Chainlink 2, that searches Black Witch. Now you can bring out your first Omni Negate. So you can see here that before you even commit the Black Witch, you have your first Omni, and you're usually going to be fishing for interactions leading up until this point. Your opponent, you now know basically what your opponent has based on what they've done or not done when you have Ilia Sylvia on field. So now you have Black Witch, and you can set whatever your target is. I'm choosing to play Betrayal. I'm not going to go into full detail on this because it's in my previous video, but this is a card that has a huge amount of flexibility regardless of whether you're going first or second, because even if you're playing into a board going second, this card, putting this in the graveyard in the very beginning of your turn, puts weird pressure on your opponent that will often cause them to misplay, because this will protect your Sinful Spoils and Diabell Star cards. So this is a very strange card because it makes your opponent act unusually, and they have to think a little bit more. The chance of them making a suboptimal play is a little bit higher. And even if they don't play suboptimal, I would say that this card is still very, very useful to have because it makes it harder for you to be interacted with. The on-field effect is obviously also decent, and it can help protect your board against cards like Dark Ruler, Droplets, or whatever. So anyhow, we get access to the Black Witch, and that means that we have access to Demod. So now we can Demod. Demod can search the Gaze of Timaeus, and now we have access to this card. Now, my general rule of thumb is, if your opponent has forced your Omni through Ilia Sylvia already, you should not be greedy, and you should probably just use Gaze of Timaeus here to bring out Dark Dragoon. Now, that is not ideal. Ideally, your opponent has not forced your Omni Gate, and that means you can be a little bit greedier and save your Timaeus, because if you use your Timaeus now, you only get to keep the Dragoon for 2 turns. But you want to extend that as much as possible. So usually I would choose to save this card and set it and bring out the Dragoon on their turn, so you still have it on the crackback, because Dragoon is kind of like a pseudo tower. It's unlikely for them to clear it unless you don't have anything else. So ideally, you want to use the body of Demod for something else that is useful, because you can use this from the field or the grave with Timaeus. So just keep that in mind. So because we want to use this and not just have this be like a dead resource on board, we're now going to use Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon, and we can bring out Fallen the White Dragon, which can then bring out Incredible Ecclesia. By the way, this is not really the worst brick in the world, because this is a level 4 tuner, and you often will be able to at least summon this for free when you're playing into boards by your opponent, and they kind of have to respond to this. They also don't know exactly what this will bring out, especially if they don't know your exact deck list. So this card isn't that bad card quality-wise. It's not great, but it's not the worst. Okay, so now you can go in this particular version into Diabell, Queen of the White Forest. So you don't actually lose this card by swapping out for another boss monster. If you're able to continue playing, you still get to make this card. So not only does your ceiling go up, but your ability to play through interactions and have better quality cards in your deck also goes up. So now that we've done all those things, and we have decided, because they haven't used our Omni, we are not using Timaeus, we can now Dark Lock ourselves, and we will Timaeus on the other turn. So now we go for the White Witch. White Witch can pitch the field spell that dumps Curse. Curse gives us Philia. You know the drill here. The Philia can now give us access to Vengeance. We get Vengeance. We can summon out Vengeance. If you want, you can choose to trigger the effect to boost by 500. You don't need to do that if you don't want to. Just keep in mind Typhon is a card. If you have things that can play around it, you don't need to care about it. Just remember that that exists. So now when you go end phase, we have our own main phase 3 now, so we can reset our Deception. Depending on what we've gone through with the Albaz stuff, we're going to be bringing back Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon and adding the Incredible Ecclesia back to our hand. Now here we do not yet have Cartesia in rotation in this particular line, and so I'll show you what this is kind of supposed to look like. So let's say our opponent begins by threatening us. They summon a Kozaki. And we have our Timaeus here. We have our Betrayal set, because this is the target we're playing. You don't have to play this one. This is the one that I like. And then we also have our Deception here, which will typically be fodder for a Diabell Queen to send. And then we also have a blank in hand. And the blank in hand, Incredible Ecclesia, is usually the Red Eyes Dark Dragoon fodder, because it's basically a free discard. So usually what you want to do is you have to be a little careful, if you have full comboed, that you don't clog your zones in an awkward way. And that's usually fine, because the Ilia Sylvia will remove itself from board when it negates, and the Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon will bring out a Cartesia that can remove itself and something like Demod. So when your opponent threatens you with a Kozaki, you, for example, bring out your Cartesia, and the Cartesia can now fuse, for example, with the Demod. Of course, that can also trigger your LZ of the White Forest, so don't forget to use those types of effects. So here you can use Cartesia and Demod to bring out the Dusk Dragon. And Dust Dragon, if you're using it offensively like this, can then dump something like the Cloud Beast. Now keep in mind, and I'll show you this in the next line, that if you are playing in a way where you're searching the Fallen and the Virtuous, or you've drawn it, you don't actually have to do this. You can dump something else that you're going to revive off of Fallen and Virtuous that can be much more powerful based on what your opponent is playing. So anyhow, here the Cloud Beast works offensively, and you can use something like the Gaze of Timaeus to bring out your Dark Dragoon. So now when you go to end phase, I'm just showing you the resource economy here. Obviously you're playing a real game. You do still get to add back whatever cards do have their add back effects. So the last thing that I want to show you here is that there are usually more interactions than you think when you look at this field, because aside from the basic stuff like Diabell Queen, your Destruction Protection, your Vengeance, your Dragoon, your Omni Negate, remember that you also have the Dust Dragon effect. So it says if a monster is special summoned by your opponent's activated monster effect, you can banish this card from your field or graveyard as cost, so this doesn't have to stick on the field. Special summon a Dogmatica monster from your deck or a Despia monster from your extra deck. So that will typically be the Luluwallalith, and that's why we're playing this as a 12 instead of Vengeance Dragon. Also remember the Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon. So sometimes you're going to have weird fields where your end board is cluttered because your opponent didn't play the way you expected, and instead of this bringing itself back to the field from banished, it actually goes into the graveyard. This is just like a little FYI, but usually if this is in the graveyard for whatever other reason, like your opponent has fizzled it, they've gotten over it for some other reason, remember that this says, if this card is in your graveyard, you can target a level 8 fusion monster in your graveyard or banishment and one card on the field. Shuffle both of those cards and this card into the deck. So not only do you recoup your resources so you can use them again, but you also have a grave interaction from this card. So it's an additional layer that is very, very strong and very useful for helping you play into boards. Okay, so the second example I want to show you before I get into the gameplay review is if you have not only a White Force starter, but you've also hard drawn Fallen of the White Dragon. Now this is a particularly good situation because you can play through many more cards with very high card quality. So here we're going to start, we're summoning LZ as usual. And we're going to play this a little bit differerently because we've drawn access to Fallen the White Dragon. So here you do your basic stuff. You go for Arciela, you search the field spell in this particular case, reset Tails, Tails search for LZ Azamina. Remember, you have to be very careful here if the Tails doesn't resolve and you don't get LZ Azamina, and then you're forced to search her off of this, you're Dark Locked. So that's why sometimes you don't actually search for Witch of the White Forest and you go directly for LZ Azamina, and you're playing a little bit less greedily. But anyhow, here you can now chain block because you are making Diabell Queen. So that's one of the advantages here is you get back your Tails. You search for Deception off LZ Azamina. You can bring out your Sylvie, use that as tribute fodder for Deception. This gives you access to Hallowed. Now you can go Hallowed. As usually, bring out the Murcielago first. Murcielago search Wanted if you didn't already get access to it. Add back Hallowed by shuffling back LZ Azamina. Hallowed Chainlink 1, Wanted Chainlink 2, search for your Witch. In this case, like usually if you're not going to make a Chaos Angel with Murcielago and a 4 in the grave, this is usually what you're going to pitch off of the Witch. But you know, there are scenarios where you do want to keep this on field. So here you summon out the Witch, you set your target. Here we are playing Betrayal. You don't have to play Betrayal, I just like the card. Now we can get rid of our Witch for Demod. Demod can search for Timaeus. So now we have access to Timaeus. Remember always the rule of thumb, if they have forced you to get rid of your Ilia Sylvia, they could be bluffing, but they may also have something much stronger, like a late Nib or whatever. And so I would say just accept the fact that you won't keep the Dragoon on the crackback and use your Timaeus early, bring out the Dragoon, keep your plays safe, and then you continue playing with the rest of your engine. So now you can use Fallen of the White Dragon from hand, dumping Albion. Now you've dumped Albion, you know you're going to get access to Fallen Virtuous in the end phase. So your Fallen of the White Dragon can now bring out your incredible Ecclesia, and those can still go into the Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon, and you haven't gone through Cartesia yet, so you still can do that if you want to. So here we bring out the Cartesia. Now, if you have locked yourself into 8s, it means you can't do something like hard sync with Cartesia and Demod into Luluwallalith, or if you were playing Vengeance Dragon, but you still can use it to hard fuse into something else because you have other options for the 8s. So here you could go into your Dusk Dragon because this is an 8, so the lock doesn't affect you even though you are locked under the Fallen of the White Dragon. And now you have to decide, like, the way they're going to play is based on your deck list, essentially, because you're summoning Dusk Dragon on your turn, which means you're dumping something on your turn. So whatever you want to play, like it could be the OG Diabells, the Sin Keeper, you know, the thing that people play against Radiant Typhoon. It could be Christia. If you're not playing these cards or you don't have access to something like just like, let's go over this real quick. So this says that if it's fusion summon, you can send a level 6 or higher light or dark monster from your deck or extract to the graveyard. So just remember that even your in-engine stuff, like your Diabellstar Vengeance, those are all legitimate targets off of this card. So if your opponent stopped like some of your searches, like maybe you didn't get access to Witch of the White Forest, but you still want to have access to your Diabellstar Vengeance, and you'll still get the summon off of it because you've made Diabell Queen. Like, there are all these different scenarios that could come up. You can just dump that instead. You don't have to have gone through your side to summon Christia, or if you're like super cringe and cheesy, you're actually main decking the Christia or the Sin Keeper, don't do that. If you're not doing those things, there still are plays to be made off this depending on what's happened so far. So just keep all of that stuff in mind. So now we go Witch of the White Forest. We'll go White Witch, dump Curse. Curse gives us Philia. Philia will give us Vengeance. Now we can summon the Vengeance if we want. We can use the Philia's effect and boost by 500. Optionally, now we go end phase. We get back our Deception. We get back our Ecclesia of the Dark Dragon. We get back Fallen the Virtuous. Now just remember here, okay? So Albion says, during the end phase, if this card is in the graveyard because it was sent there this turn, which it was, you can add to your hand or set one branded spell or trap from your deck. So the important thing to remember here is you are only going to set the Fallen the Virtuous if you do not need to use it in the end phase. But there are scenarios where you would want to, for example, if you had dumped the Sin Keeper, you want to block them from quick plays before their turn starts. You don't want to now be trying to bring it out after their turn starts and then they can chain their quick plays. And the same, possibly, depending on the matchup or your read or whatever, could be true for Christia or whatever else you're trying to play. So basically just remember, if you need to bring out the target you're dumping before their turn starts, then you're going to add the Fallen Virtuous to your hand and not set it. But I feel like as a rule of thumb, setting it, aside from the Sin Keeper anti-quick play shenanigans, is probably usually better, because this way you get to keep an additional layer and you don't commit everything to your board. And you wait and force your opponent to play through your interactions first, and as they struggle to do that and your board's place clears up, then you can use Fallen the Virtuous after that. So just keep in mind, that's generally how it works. And of course you get to add back your Cartesia and your Incredible Ecclesia, and that's basically how that works. Okay, so now let's get into the gameplay analysis. This will be game 1 of 3 against Dracotail Branded. I have won the dice roll, but I've drawn a very weird hand. So there's a duplicate here with Black Witch, and kind of like a pseudo-duplicate in terms of wanted, although obviously this is way better than drawing a third Black Witch. We do have Tales of the White Forest, which is engine because we have a way to make it live, and we do have one non-engine in the form of the Fallen and the Virtuous. And remember, drawing this card is actually very, very useful because it can change the way you play your end board. Like if you have access to Dusk Dragon stuff and you dump something and then you're going to revive that either before their turn starts or during their turn, this gives you a lot of flexibility in how you want to play. So now we're going to start by summoning the Black Witch, because this is really the only play we have. We're obviously not going to want it for a third Witch, and we're not going to want it for a Vengeance that is not even summonable. So here we're going to start with the only play we have. We summon the Witch by pitching the Witch. And here I'm trying to keep my options open and not reveal too much here. So I just show that I have a duplicate, and the opponent immediately reveals they are in fact on Dracotail. Now they get rid of Droll. And I guess that there are lots of people who are playing Wanted or Azamina packages because of Demon and Dragoon, so maybe I guess he doesn't know that I'm playing White Forest, but obviously you would typically keep Droll against White Forest. Though I suppose this could also give me the idea that he has 2 spells in hand, like Rahu and whatever, and maybe there isn't another monster, and he needs actually to use the only other monster in his hand. So I guess I don't know exactly how to read this yet, but this is what happens. So now he goes into Secretarian Dragon. Now let's just go over a few things. So I have a couple different options for what I want to do with the Witch, because I'm summoning the Witch, I'm triggering the effect, and before I set my target, he is showing me the Secretarian Dragon. So this card says, while you control this fusion summon card, your opponent cannot activate the effects of special summon dragon or spellcaster monsters they control. So I need to be careful because I have to get rid of this, right? Like I need to have something that gets rid of this, because otherwise this is basically a floodgate. But at the same time, he also has used the Urgula as material. So remember, this card says, if this card is sent to the graveyard as material for a fusion summon, you can set a Dracotail spell/trap from your deck. Then you can destroy a spell/trap on field. So I know that whatever I set is going to be destroyed. The most important thing that means is that I cannot set Deception, because if I set Deception, then I'm just going to lose it. So maybe there's another way that I can get Deception later on in the combo. Now, setting Subversion here is actually the wrong play, because if you were thinking, well, you could just set Subversion and that is your out to Secretarian Dragon, that would only be true if he didn't have a way to remove the Subversion. So actually putting Subversion here is the wrong play, and in my particular deck list, I should have set Betrayal, because then Betrayal would be popped, go to the graveyard, and then I would have that as an additional layer of insulation against the things that Betrayal protects. But anyhow, so I set the Subversion here, and that's going to get popped when the chain resolves. So he gets access to Flame. So so everyone remembers, this is the one that targets a face-up spell on the field and negates its effects. So he's going to pop the Subversion. And now I'm in a position where I do still have an out actually to Secretarian Dragon, and even though I have lost my Subversion, this is still a Sinful Spoils card, and even though my Wanted was kind of a weird draw because I drew Double Witch, I do have a way to get an additional draw by putting back one Sinful Spoils name after resolving the Wanted. So, you know, I do have ways to like fish for other draws and see what I can play. But I don't want to play into the Secretarian, so I immediately here use Fallen of the Virtuous. We get rid of the Albion here, which means we're going to get access to another Fallen of the Virtuous later, so that's obviously great. So there's no more Secretarian, and now I go for Demod. And my thought process here is, if my Tails fizzles, I immediately lose the game. So if he has Ash on Tails, my game is basically over. So I need to demod first, because either he's going to allow the demod or he has to allow the demod to resolve, and that means that, you know, I can just Tails later on, because also remember that the Dragoon is a spellcaster, right? So we're not turning off our Tails by bringing out Dragoon first, okay? So I go demod and he goes Ash. So okay, he can't Ash me again. So I'm like, okay, now I can Tails, and then he immediately scoops because there's nothing else he can do. I mean, this is basically full combo. You know, it doesn't really matter now at this point. I can play the game any way that I choose to. So he decides to surrender, and that is game one. Okay, so now let's get to game 2 against Dracotail Branded. So here, let's take a look at our hand again. We have a very weird hand again, where we have double Black Witch, we have the Fallen of the Virtuous, and we have Betrayal. So our only non-engine that we can use out of turn is Mulcharmy Perulia. So obviously, since our opponent is going first, we're going to start by using Perulia, and they go Chainlink 2 Ash Blossom. So we've traded 1-for-1 so far, and all I have is a card that I can use in my turn. I don't have any other way to interact with him. So he's basically just going to be able to play completely uninterrupted. So he started with Fallen the White Dragon in hand, so that means he can dump Albion, and already we know that means he has access to his own Fallen the Virtuous. So things are looking pretty good for him so far. He brings out Incredible Ecclesia, he goes into Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon, that brings out Cartesia, and the thing you always have to remember with Cartesia is that even if you have ways to interact with your opponent, like an Imperm or something like that, even though it may not be very popular right now, you don't want to give your opponent opportunities to dodge stuff. So always keep that in mind. Even if they're not immediately using stuff, usually players who have opportunities to dodge will place this on board before they commit to further plays. So anyhow, now he goes for the Rahu and Mululu, and that brings out the Arthalion. Arthalion adds back, he gets Ketu Dragontail set, and he sets Sting, and he adds back Mululu. So now we have access to the Urgula, and he summons Mululu. He goes into a second Arthalion, and I think here the idea is just that he wants to have 3 traps set. I actually can't remember now, because I wasn't paying complete attention, if we saw him search all 3 traps, or if we saw him search 2, and then he set the 3rd unknown. And then in the end phase, we see the Fallen of the Virtuous get set. Maybe that's what happened. So he adds back Incredible Ecclesia, which obviously is amazing in his deck, because just additional fodder for going into your fusions. So here we're facing down, we know double trap for sure, and the Fallen of the Virtuous, and possibly the set 3rd trap, which would not be that unlikely based on what's happened so far. He has a way to fuse on field, which is also a way to dodge, and he has access to Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon. And because he's playing that deck, we can assume he probably has at least one OG Albaz in his deck, which means he has another way to interact with our plays. So here we draw Wanted for turn. Sorry, I went there a little fast, but I believe we've just drawn the Wanted for turn. So we go draw phase, Wanted, and usually when you have limited ways to play, you need to play in ways where you're fishing for interactions. And he does indeed reveal, I can't remember if we knew this for sure, the Dracotail Flame to negate the Wanted. And this puts us in a weird position, because now we have very limited plays, right? We have Fallen the Virtuous, and this is going to be something that potentially fizzles his Blazing Cartesia, or fizzles his OG Albaz that this will bring out, or possibly chain blocks his Gulamel shenanigans. but he has so many different ways of playing that this doesn't really answer all of those things, right? So it means that the Black Witch dumping the Betrayal has to carry a lot of weight right now because our Wanted did not resolve. So the Wanted fizzles here, and we go Black Witch and we pitch Betrayal. Okay, so now remember that one of the things that I said about Betrayal is the graveyard effect here says, when your opponent activates a card or effect in response to your Diabell Star monster effect or your Sinful Spell / Trap card or effect activation, you can banish this card from your graveyard as cost, negate that opponent's effect. So this is kind of like if you are only a Modern player and you're playing against like Radiant Typhoon or whatever, this means that when I use an effect, so like if I go Diabell Star Chainlink 1, whatever he does in response, that is the thing I can negate. I don't get to wait until he adds a bunch of stuff in the chain later on to then decide that I can use Betrayal and negate that thing. You know, it's not like Magic. So at this moment, I make a huge mistake, okay? So just remember, okay, let's think about where we are so far. We have summoned Black Witch by pitching Betrayal, which is our protection, okay? He has gone Chainlink to Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon, and we can negate the Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon. And here what my incorrect thought process was, is I'm thinking, there's almost no way I can win, right? So I need to play in an extremely greedy way and hope that he makes mistakes. And so I decide that I'm not going to respond with Betrayal. I'm going to allow this to resolve, and I'm thinking that I need to use the Betrayal on something else, or maybe he makes a very strange play and I get to use Betrayal later on with something else, right? So I'm thinking that maybe I'm going to set the Deception and he's already used the Dracotail Flame, and then maybe I can protect my Deception with Betrayal. I'm thinking something like that. So now he's like, oh, okay, you're not using Betrayal to stop my Ecclesia? Well, then I'm just going to Sting here. And so he can Sting me, and he can get rid of my Betrayal, so it's not even an option to use later on. So this was a huge miscalculation on my part, right? He's like, he immediately clocks that I'm just being greedy, and this play doesn't make any sense at all. And I'll explain a little bit more why this was such an important mistake later on, but let's just continue the gameplay for the moment. So now the Ecclesia brings out the Fallen of Albaz, and I set my Deception. He uses Albaz on summon effect, pitching the free Ecclesia, and now I'm basically forced to fall in the Virtuous anyhow, right? Which would have been avoided if I had just negated the Ecclesia. So I go Fallen the Virtuous to try to pop the Albaz, and then he's going to go Blazing Cartesia's Chainlink 3 so that he can, well, he's not really dodging this card because obviously OG Albaz has to stay on field to fuse, so he's not dodging it, but he is still using the body in a way, I suppose. So he's going to use the OG Albaz, and he's going to make the Star Source. So now I'm in a very, very awkward position because he gets to pop my Deception because he's now summoned Star Source. And on top of that, he can now on-res, Fallen the Virtuous, pop my Witch before I have a chance to go into Demod and search for Timmy. So now I'm thinking like, okay, this was really stupid. And my last play, because I've already used Witch, I've drawn a duplicate, is to use Wanted Engrave, shuffle back my Betrayal, and see what I can get. Now here I get extraordinarily lucky, okay? And this is why my misplay earlier is going to matter so much, and I'll explain this as we go through this. So here, I normal summon my Sylvie, okay? I search for Witch of the White Forest. Here he goes Dracotail Horn to bounce, and maybe the thought process is, if he horns here versus later, it doesn't matter, because the most important thing is that I don't have two bodies on field to do the Synchro Ladder. I'm assuming that that's his thought process here, and so he's thinking it doesn't matter if he horns here or later. Okay, that's what I think he's thinking. So he bounces the Sylvie, but I've already searched the Witch of the White Forest, okay? So I Witch, and obviously here, I'm going to go for White Witch into Vengeance, right? Like that's the play that you typically make at the very end. So that's my idea here. And I'm thinking that I can maybe still win if I get to resolve White Witch and Vengeance. So I White Witch, but he has the Phimena, and now he can go for the Gulamel Urgula play. So now what he gets to do is he gets to Urgula and pop my only spell trap so that I no longer have a way to play with the White Witch. And so now you can see that the huge issue with Betrayal is I should not have played super greedily hoping he would do something really stupid. I should instead have just used Betrayal at the correct time and then pray, not for him to make a stupid play at that point, but pray to draw an insane draw off of the Wanted draw. And I did get an insane draw off the Wanted draw, but I basically denied myself the chance of winning by not using Betrayal when I had the opportunity to do so. So I wanted to show you a replay that had in a huge mistake that possibly determined the outcome of the match there. So that is game 2. Okay, so now we get to game 3, the final game against Dracotail branded, and obviously this is post side, and I'm still playing Skill Drain because this card is still extraordinary in White Forest because you get to remove it whenever you want. So here we have, again, a weird hand though. So there's one Skill Drain, we have one Timmy, we have Wanted, we have Fallen the Virtuous, and we also have Incredible Ecclesia. So kind of a strange hand here. So I'm going first because I lost the last game because I was a fool and I did not use Betrayal when I was supposed to. Draw phase, I go Wanted, he goes Bell. Okay, so the Wanted fizzles. And unlike previously, we don't have something in our hand that immediately allows us to have the option to get the draw off of Wanted. So this is basically just a 1-for-1 without advancing our own game state. So now we summon Incredible Ecclesia, we use the effect to bring out Fallen the White Dragon, and that can, for some reason, just bring the same thing back from the grave because this card is so incredible. So now we have 2 4s on field. And we don't really get anything useful by going for Diabell Queen, I think. I think we just need to go for the resource play and try to get more cards on field and hope to live another turn and maybe survive off of Skill Drain until we draw a starter. So we're really playing like on very, very limited resources here. So now we will use Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon's effect to bring out the Cartesia. We don't really have a good play yet, but we also don't really have anything else to bring out at this time. So we set our Fallen the Virtuous, we set our Skill Drain, we keep our Timmy in hand because there's nothing to do with it. Our Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon comes back in the end phase. And now our opponent goes to play. So what I need to say here, because this will look ridiculous otherwise, it doesn't show you this in the replay, but the opponent was attempting to go end of main, okay? So they do nothing, they have nothing on board, and they say end of main. So I'm like, okay, he has Evenly. We know that that's a very popular card in the format. There's no reason to expect this is a bluff or whatever. Okay, we have limited resources anyhow. So he goes end of main. We say, okay, we go Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon to bring out Ecclesia, Incredible Ecclesia. We're going to try to protect as many of our resources as possible through an Evenly. Okay, remember we have our Skill Drain, Fallen and Virtuous, and we're expecting he's going to Evenly. So we bring out Incredible Ecclesia. Now he again goes end of main on res. He goes end of main again. So we go Blazing Cartesia to fuse. Okay. He goes Chainlink 2, Fallen, and the Virtuous. So we're teasing out some interactions here, okay, as he's attempting to go end of main to evenly us, okay? He tries to stop us. I guess he doesn't know what we're gonna dump off of Dusk Dragon because there's so many things you could dump, and maybe he's afraid of whatever that is. And the idea here was actually maybe there's a way to set up the grave to where we could dump like a Christia, and then we could bring out the Christia, and then maybe he would just not be able to play, right? So we force him to use Fallen the Virtuous before evenly. Usually that doesn't happen, right? He's going to evenly, and then he's going to decide what he wants to do after that. So we force out a resource. Again, he goes end of main, okay? So we have our Incredible Ecclesia on field. We have Skill Drain. We have Fallen the Virtuous, okay? So now he goes evenly, and we're like, okay, well, we want to... There's no reason to get our Incredible Ecclesia out of rotation, okay? So we're going to Fallen the Virtuous, our own Incredible Ecclesia, which also dumps Albion, which means we're going to get back another Fallen the Virtuous later on, okay? So we're playing like a very, very tight, controlled resource loop right now. And we keep access to our Skill Drain on field. So now it's main phase 2, he has no battle phase. He normal summons Lucius, which means we just have to Skill Drain, right? Like there's no reason to not Skill Drain at this point. He chains 5 mana, but like even so, like there's no reason to hold the Skill Drain, I don't think, at this point. So he can dodge the search on Lucius. He gets a 5 mana in hand. The Arthalion is going to be negated, at least we have that much. So 5 mana in hand. Lucius will set the Rahu. So let's just keep this in mind. So there's a Rahu set, there's a 5 mana in hand, okay? We have actually a decent resource economy set to play out over the next turn. Okay, so 5 mana in hand, Rahu set. So he goes Rahu. He uses everything to make a Gulamel, which will now obviously also be negated, but he can use Urgula to pop the Skill Drain. So now he's no longer under Skill Drain, but at least we got to negate the Arthalion. So now he goes Pan in hand, okay, Pan in hand, and 5 mana. Pan and 5 mana in hand, okay? So he has Pan and 5 mana in hand and the Fallen and the Virtuous. So let's look and see what happens next. So our Blazing Cartesia comes back, our Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon comes back, we still have our Timmy, our Albion gives us another Fallen the Virtuous, our Incredible Ecclesia comes back, and now we draw for turn, and we draw Wanted, I believe. That went a little bit quickly, but I believe we draw Wanted. And so we go draw phase Wanted here, and the opponent scoops. Why does the opponent scoop? Okay, they have the Fallen the Virtuous, and they have a 5 mana with a Pan in hand. But here's the thing, like, let's think about one of the ways that this could play out, okay? So let's say that the opponent's thought process is he has the Fallen and the Virtuous, and maybe he wants to use that in draw phase to pop my Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon because this is a main phase effect to tag out, right? And as far as he knows, there are more targets for this. So maybe he wants to pop this in the draw phase, for example. If he pops this in the draw phase, I actually get the Grave effect, which will recycle my resources, and I will get a free bounce. So the Gulamel isn't really going to be an interaction at that point. I'm just going to be able to remove the Gulamel or force the Gulamel for free if he does that. And look at all of the other stuff in my hand. You know, I still have a pop or a special summon depending on what I'm doing. If he doesn't have a way to negate my Wanted, this can give me everything. I have access to a 12 if I want. I have access to a fusion summon if I want. There's basically nothing that I don't have at this point if he can't stop the Wanted. So him being able to destroy a monster, you know, off of the pan as fusion material or whatever, doesn't really matter when I have so much stuff in my hand and he doesn't have any other ways to continue playing. So that is game 3. Okay, so let me give you my final thoughts on this version and whether I think this is better or worse or the same as the pure version. So in terms of pure card quality and nothing else, the more copies of Fallen the White Dragon exist in your deck, the better your deck is just in terms of card quality. So your ability to play into boards, to play through interactions when you're going first, to have more options for extenders, or in this case, actually something that is part of your core engine because you do access it in your standard combo through Ecclesia and the Dark Dragon. All of those things are strict upgrades with Fallen of the White Dragon. There are cool plays where you include one OG Albaz in your deck, and the ceiling for the plays you can do is dramatically stronger. You also have dramatically better layers, things like making a Mirror Jade in the end phase with an OG Albaz. Those are all things you can also do. But what I want to do with this version of the deck is to avoid adding bricks if possible and try to add only high quality cards. So playing more Fallen the White Dragon is something you can definitely do. But you have to be careful what type of deck you're building when you think about what else you would remove. Do you want to play the triple betrayal strategy, which you saw me not take advantage of in game 2, for example? Do you want to play other targets? I'm strongly against certain cards like Sinful Spoils of the White Forest because this deck already has engine requirements, or cards that are extremely low quality like Hallowed Azamina or Deception of the Sinful Spoils or the Gaze of Timaeus, and adding more of these cards in means that the chance of you drawing bricked hands or hands that are much harder to continue playing through interactions just continues to go up. So I feel like it's the wrong choice to play those types of cards, but there are other good players that swear by it and they still play those types of cards, so you don't need to listen to only my opinion. I would say that this card, Subversion, is a strong favorite of mine. I've loved this card for a very long time, and one of the things that I like about this card is it adds in a huge amount of flexibility because this card is just one of your non-engine slots, okay? So this is like playing Fulos or Perulia in the sense that this is not competing with your engine ratios. This is one of your non-engine slots, just like the Fallen and the Virtuous is also one of your non-engine slots, except this is also accessible through your own engine. And this allows you to have a super premium removal, probably the best type of removal in the game after banishing face down, arguably. You have access to this through your own engine. And whether you're going first and your opponent is placing bodies on field, like when I showed you they summoned Secretarian, and if they hadn't been able to pop this with Urgula, this would have been an out to Secretarian. You know, there are lots of weird situations like that where this card adds flexibility that nothing else would give you. So the fact that this, you know, unlike other Sinful Spoils cards or other targets off of Black Witch or whatever like Morian, this gives you lots of unique ways to play immediately. You don't just have to set it as a card that's only really good going first. So I really like this card and I highly recommend that you at least test this before you decide you don't want to play it. In terms of the other cards in the deck that you are playing or not playing, Fallen the Virtuous is obviously a meta staple at the moment. You don't really have to argue for the inclusion or not of this card, but I will say that in this particular version, because you are playing Dusk Dragon, this card becomes much more important. Hard drawing this card becomes very, very strong because you can use this as a way to bring out a card, to special summon a card that you've dumped off of Dusk Dragon later on, even before your opponent's turn even starts, which is especially important if you're playing things like Sinkeeper against Radiant Typhoon or other quick play spell type of decks. So just keep those things in mind. I would say that you don't have to play Blazing Cartesia if you are playing a Fallen the White Dragon package, but I think this gives you a decent amount of flexibility, additional layers, because remember this also has a different on-field / graveyard effect that makes it a very strong type of card. And I would say in terms of the extra deck that I don't think you have to play Chorozo and Moragina. You also don't have to play Chaos Angel. And in a meta where the Fallen and Virtuous is running around, I would say that this card becomes, instead of one of the core best cards in all of White Forest, it becomes debatably optional. And if you are at a place where you are looking at now 3 optional cards, Trozo, Moragina, and Chaos Angel, you actually can play Poplar of the White Forest, Snake Eyes Doom Dragon, and Snake Eyes Vengeance without taking out the Despian Lulu Wallet. So that is something that you can play. I do miss those cards in testing. Having the option to have an automatic OTK win button with White Witch and Vengeance after using all of your other resources is an incredible tool to have. You just have to think a little bit differently about how you want to play the deck. The only other thing I really want to talk about here is that I've seen other builds play 1 or 2 copies of Black Witch, and I don't think that that is wrong per se, but I do think that this card is so strong to start with because of the existence of DMod that I don't feel there's a reason to play less than 3 of this card. The fact that you get to start by threatening a Dragoon before anything else, or there are lots of other options like the Master of Chaos, I believe it's called, which is where if you're playing into boards, you get to just destroy all monsters or banish all monsters your opponent controls. The fact that you get a free summon off of this, you target a light or dark monster, graveyard special summon it. This is an 8 that's a dark, where you can also go into Chaos Angel off of this. This is an extraordinary card that gives you great flex off the DMod stuff, but you don't really have space for it when you're playing a version of this that is very hungry for extra deck spaces. But just keep in mind that these are all things that exist and all options that you can take. So with that, thank you for watching. If you have any suggestions, please let me know. If you want to join the Discord, the link is in the description below. If you want to buy me a coffee, the link is also in the description below. See you in the next video.